Henry George was born on the 2nd of September, 1839 in Philadelphia. His family rented this building at 413 South 10th Street, which from the 1950s until 2013 served as the Philadelphia extension of the Henry George School of Social Science. The building was temporarily converted into a museum and archive center in 2014, but closed in 2017. As a youth, Henry attended lectures at the Franklin Institute and spent a good deal of his time at the piers along the Delaware River, learning about the ships and the trade carried into and out of Philadelphia. In 1855, he went to sea as a foremast boy on the merchant ship Hindu, bound for Melbourne, Australia, and Calcutta, India. Upon arrival in Calcutta, he wrote this in his journal. One feature which is peculiar to Calcutta was the number of dead bodies floating down in all stages of decomposition, covered by crows who were actively engaged in picking them to pieces. The first one I saw filled me with horror and disgust, but like the natives, you soon cease to pay any attention to them. Upon his return to Philadelphia in 1856, Henry's father obtained a position for him with a printing firm, where he learned how to set type. Henry, in later years, recalled his first real discussion on a serious question of political economy. An old printer observed to him that while in old countries wages are low, in new countries they are always high. Neither the printer nor Henry at the time could explain why this was so. He took an interest in political questions and argued strongly against slavery with family members and friends. He later wrote, "Over and over again I have heard all questions of slavery silenced by the declaration that the Negroes were the property of their masters, and that to take away a man's slave without payment was as much a crime as to take away his horse without payment." Just a year later, he left his job setting type and signed on to a schooner taking a load of coal from Philadelphia to Boston. Upon his return to Philadelphia, he wrote to a friend, "The times here are very hard and are getting worse and worse every day. Factory after factory is suspending and discharging its hands. There are thousands of hard-working mechanics now out of employment in this city." This next year, Henry signed on as a ship's steward aboard a steamship bound for San Francisco. As did many others, Henry left the ship before his term of enlistment expired. He was intent on joining the thousands of others headed into the gold fields along the Fraser River. He worked his way to Victoria, Vancouver Island, on a schooner, then began working in a store managed by his cousin that served the needs of the miners. He considered going to the gold fields, but news from returning miners dissuaded him from doing so. He soon returned to San Francisco, where he found employment setting type. In a letter to his sister Jenny, he wrote, "After being deprived of reading for such a time, it is quite delightful to be able to read as much as I wish. In the house in which I am stopping, there is a good library, which to me is one of its prominent attractions." He now began his informal study of political economy, reading selections from a small library in the hotel where he was living. Although one of the books available was Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Henry recalled later that he did not read it at the time. For a while during 1858, he found work typesetting. Laid off, he took a job weighing rice. Then, when the rice mill closed, Henry headed for the California gold fields. He later recalled, Having no other ways of reaching them, I started out to walk. I was in fact what would now be called a tramp. He did farm work and manual labor to make enough money to live, but did not reach the gold fields and was forced to return to San Francisco. Later in 1858, Henry returned to work in the printing trade for the Weekly Home Journal. He lost this position after the paper was sold by its owner. After this, he went into partnership with other printers to start a new newspaper, the Evening Journal. By 1860, Henry began to seriously think about the changes to life in California brought on by population growth. In this year, he is also introduced to his future wife, Annie Corsina Fox. Her father, an officer in the British Army, married Elizabeth McCloskey, whose family had immigrated to Australia from Ireland. When Elizabeth's family left Australia for California, the couple separated. Elizabeth took their 2 daughters to California, but died not long after in San Francisco. Annie Fox ended up living with her grandmother and aunt. Henry's first newspaper, the Evening Journal, survives, but just barely until mid-November, when the partnership dissolved. The reason for the paper's financial problems was the completion of the Transcontinental Telegraph, controlled by a press association monopoly. Henry and Annie Fox married in 1861. Their first son, Henry Jr., was born in November of 1862. Henry was now working for a newspaper in Sacramento. In 1862, Samuel Clemens was working as a newspaperman with a growing reputation as a humorist. He came to Sacramento to lecture. Henry George was hired to take tickets at the door. In January of 1864, Henry got into an argument with the newspaper's foreman, and he was discharged. He returned to San Francisco and to his former newspaper, the Evening Bulletin, as a typesetter. A few months later, he entered into partnership with several others to form a new printing business. This business venture generated little revenue and put Henry George deeper into debt. During these days, he often did not eat breakfast for lack of money. He wrote in his diary, "I came near starving to death, and at one time I was so close to it that I think I should have done so but for the job of printing a few cards which enabled us to buy a little cornmeal." His second child, Richard, was born on the 27th of January in 1865. They had no food in the house. Henry went out, intent on getting money from someone. He stopped the man, told him his situation, and the man gave him $5. George later wrote, "If he had not, I think I was desperate enough to have killed him." In 1865, Henry began his first serious writing, including a signed letter to the editor urging working men to think about political and social questions. In it, he wrote, "I hope to see fearless opinions of men and measures ably maintained, and the intelligence of our class brought to the solution of questions of political and social economy which deeply affect us, that we may bring our united efforts to the advancement of those great principles upon which our republican institutions rest, and upon which we must depend to secure for us and our children our proper place and rights, and for our country her proud and foremost rank among the nations." Following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Henry George wrote a remembrance of Lincoln, written as a letter to the editor, but printed by the editor as an article. George was then given assignments as a reporter for the paper, and his submissions printed as editorials. The year 1866 found Henry working at his printing trade back in Sacramento, doing work for the state government. At this time, he believed in the protection of local industry from external competition as the only way to keep employment and wages high. However, after listening to a speech by a leading protectionist, Henry discarded these ideas in favor of free trade. He later recalled that when asked what he thought in response to the protectionist speech by the land agent of the Central Pacific Railroad, he said, "If what he said was true, it seemed to me that the country that was hardest to get at must be the best country to live in, and that instead of merely putting duties on things brought from abroad, we ought to put them on things brought from anywhere, and that fires and wars and impediments to trade and navigation were the very best things to levy on commerce." His professional life now took a major turn for the better. In June of 1867, he was appointed managing editor of the San Francisco Times. Then, in 1868, he was engaged by owners of another paper, the San Francisco Herald, to travel to New York to try to get the paper admitted to the Associated Press or establish a news service for the paper. The effort failed because of opposition from the Associated Press, whose owners pressured Western Union to dramatically increase the rates charged to Henry George's newly created news service. Henry's first major serious writing, What the Railroad Will Bring Us, was published in 1868 in the Overland Monthly. In this article, he concluded, "For years, the high rate of interest and the high rate of wages prevailing in California have been special subjects for the lamentations of a certain school of local political economists who could not see that high wages and high interest were indications that the natural wealth of the country was not yet monopolized, that great opportunities were open to all, who did not know that these were evidences of social health, and that it were as wise to lament them as for the maiden to wish to exchange the natural bloom on her cheek for the interesting pallor of the invalid." Early in 1869, he wrote an article published in the New York Tribune on the Chinese on the Pacific Coast. In this article, he opposed unrestricted immigration, and Chinese immigration particularly, for reasons of cultural and racial differences. Years later, he recalled this article as crude in its presentation of economic ideas. Even so, in November of 1869, Henry George received a letter from the British political economist John Stuart Mill, responding to Henry George's article on the assimilation of immigrants. Mill wrote, "Concerning the purely economic view of the subject, I entirely agree with you, and it could be hardly better stated and argued than it is in your article in the New York Tribune. That the Chinese immigration, if it attains great dimensions, must be economically injurious to the mass of the present population, that it must diminish their wages and reduce them to a lower stage of physical comfort and well-being, I have no manner of doubt." In 1886, his own book Defending Free Trade was published. He came to see that certain changes in law and taxation were essential before eliminating tariffs or even restrictions on immigration would lead to widespread benefits. In 1869, Henry campaigned unsuccessfully to become the Democratic Party's nominee for the California Assembly. Getting the party's support required a payment to the party's managers that Henry George refused to make. In an address delivered on the 26th of March, 1878 in San Francisco, titled "Why Work is Scarce, Wages Low, and Labor Restless," Henry revealed the truth he had come to, the reason why workers feared new immigrants. To abolish land monopoly will be to make short work of the Chinese question, root the white race in the soil, and all the millions of Asia cannot dispossess it. Henry then met Henry Haight, governor of California, an avowed Jeffersonian Democrat. He also befriended a member of the governor's staff, John Scott. Both were by now members of the American Free Trade League. As a result of his new associations, Henry was appointed editor of the Democratic Party paper, The Transcript. While in this position, he met William Swinton, brother of a well-known New York radical, a lecturer on literature and history at the newly established University of California at Oakland, who encouraged Henry to broaden his self-education. Henry had become focused on the coming of railroads to California. He concluded that one of the things the railroad would bring was accelerating land speculation, driving up prices and the cost of living for working people. While taking a ride in the country one day, he asked a passing teamster what land in the area was worth. He was told that one landowner might sell him some land nearby for $1,000 an acre. Henry later wrote, "Like a flash, it came upon me that there was the reason of advancing poverty with advancing wealth. With the growth of population, land grows in value, and the men who work it must pay more for the privilege." In February of 1870, Henry accepted an offer by Governor Haight to become managing editor of the state's main Democratic Party paper, the Sacramento Reporter. Several years of research and thinking about what political economists had referred to as the land question resulted in his first book, Our Land and Land Policy, published in 1871. Henry was just 32 years old. He found it absolutely unbelievable that so much of the nation's land area had already come under the control of just a small number of people and business entities. Of California, he wrote, "With but 600,000 inhabitants, free land should be plentiful. Yet the notorious fact is that so reckless has been the land policy that the immigrant in 1871 has, as a general thing, to pay a charge to middlemen before he can begin to cultivate the soil. Already individuals hold thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres apiece." Henry George's understanding of political economy is by this time already well developed. He makes the penetrating observation that the value of land is not an element in the wealth of a community. It indicates the distribution of wealth. The value of land and the value of labor must bear to each other an inverse ratio. Henry George in this work provides his views on what the nation's land policy should be: the taxation of the full annual rental value of land. Why should we not go back to the old system and charge the expense of government upon our lands? This had been the practice for much of history around the world until the ownership of land had become privatized. Land taxation does not bear at all upon production. It adds nothing to prices and does not affect the cost of living. As it does not add to prices, it costs the people nothing in addition to what it yields the government. While as land cannot be hid or moved, this tax can be collected with more ease and certainty and with less expense than any other tax, and the landowner cannot shift it to anyone else. A tax upon the value of land is the most equal of all taxes, because the value of land is something that belongs to all, and in taxing land values, we are merely taking for the use of the community something which belongs to the community. A scholarly lawyer he knew in San Francisco informed Henry George that the proposals he advocated were essentially the same as those put forward a century earlier by a French school of political economists known as the physiocrats. George later wrote of this exchange, "I forget many things, but the place where I heard this, and the tone and attitude of the man who told me of it, are photographed on my memory. For when you have seen a truth that those around you do not see, it is one of the deepest of pleasures to hear of others who have seen it." In 1871, Henry's next move was to co-found a new daily newspaper, the San Francisco Evening Post. The paper announced that its editorials would oppose centralization and monopolies of all kinds. In 1872, Henry was elected a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. Then, returning to California, he campaigned hard for Horace Greeley's election to the presidency. Of Greeley, he later wrote, "We all felt in this sturdy, benignant old man we had a candidate around whom we could all rally, and who fittingly represented the grandest idea of the time, the idea of reconciliation." An economic downturn beginning in 1875 caused the paper's financial backer to demand repayment of a large loan only recently extended. The principals of the paper were under great pressure to raise the cash to make the repayment. Henry George turned over his interest in the paper and departed. He decided to leave the Evening Post so that he could devote time to a serious writing project. He wrote to California Governor Irwin to request a position with the state. In seeking this appointment, he asked the governor to give me a place where there was little to do and something to get, so that I might devote myself to some important writing. In January of 1876, Henry was appointed State Inspector of Gas Meters. In March of 1876, he makes his first political speech in San Francisco. He declares, "Fellow citizens, Negro slavery is dead. But cast your eyes over the North today and see a worse than Negro slavery taking root under the pressure of the policy you are asked to support by your votes. See 70,000 men out of work in the Pennsylvania coal fields, 50,000 laborers asking for bread in the city of New York." In 1877, Henry delivered a lecture on the study of political economy to students and faculty of the newly established University of California at Berkeley. He had initially been invited to do a series of lectures. However, he so alarmed some of the university faculty and governing board by his views that he was not invited to return. A few excerpts from his lecture will serve to explain. The very importance of the subjects with which political economy deals raises obstacles in its way. The discoveries of other sciences may challenge pernicious ideas, but the conclusions of political economy involve pecuniary interests, and thus thrill directly the sensitive pocket nerve. For the study of political economy, you need no special knowledge, no extensive library, no costly laboratory. You do not even need textbooks nor teachers, if you will but think for yourselves. All you need is care in reducing complex phenomena to their elements, in distinguishing the essential from the accidental, and in applying the simple laws of human action with which you are familiar. On the 4th of July in 1877, Henry delivered a stirring speech on the American Republic. He reminded his audience that Republican government is yet but an experiment. They who look upon liberty as having accomplished her mission, when she has abolished hereditary privileges and given men the ballot, have not seen her real grandeur. Liberty is the source, the mother, the necessary condition. Where liberty rises, there virtue grows, wealth increases, knowledge expands, invention multiplies human powers, and in strength and spirit the freer nation rises among her neighbors, taller and fairer. By September of 1877, he was ready to begin the writing of his monumental treatise, to which he eventually gave the title Progress and Poverty. He researched the subject and issues thoroughly, as indicated by the fact that his personal library now included some 800 volumes on political economy, history, biography, philosophy, and other subjects. In June of 1878, Henry delivered one of his most powerful and oft-repeated addresses titled Moses at the Young Men's Hebrew Association of San Francisco. In the Mosaic Code, Henry George found a fundamental principle of justice too long ignored. It is not the protection of property, but the protection of humanity that is the aim of the Mosaic Code. Its sanctions are not directed to securing the strong and heaping up wealth, so much as to preventing the weak from being crowded to the wall. At every point, it interposes its barriers to the selfish greed that, if left unchecked, will sure differentiate men into landlord and serf, capitalist and workman, millionaire and tramp, ruler and ruled. Henry completed the manuscript of Progress and Poverty in March of 1879. The book was rejected by a New York publisher, D. Appleton and Company, with the comment, "There is very little to encourage the publication of any such work at this time, and we feel we must decline it." Henry decided the only way to have the book published was to make his own plates. A former partner, William Hinton, offered his services to set the type and make the plates. As the process started, Henry made numerous revisions to the text. When finished, he dedicated the book to those who, seeing the vice and misery that spring from the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege, feel the possibility of a higher social state and would strive for its attainment. In August of 1879, Henry published the author's edition of Progress and Poverty, which he sent to publishers in the United States and England. He also sent a copy to Sir George Grey in New Zealand, who responded, "I have already read a large part of the book. I regard it as one of the ablest works on the great questions of the time. It will be of great use to me." Finally, in October of 1879, D. Appleton agreed to publish Progress and Poverty using the plates provided by Henry George. This edition appeared in January of 1880. Henry came east to New York to lecture and promote the book. An inexpensive paper-covered edition followed in April, and this printing sold out quickly. At year-end, the book was translated into German, and sales of this edition grew rapidly. He soon began his next book, The Irish Land Question, What It Involves and How Alone It Can Be Settled, which was published early in 1881 with the more general title removing the reference to Ireland. Later in the year, Henry was hired by the New York newspaper Irish World to travel to Ireland and England to report on the rising tension between Irish nationals and absentee English landlords. In his first dispatch to the Irish World, Henry commented on the nature of what passed for government in Ireland. It is not merely a despotism. It is a despotism sustained by alien force and wielded in the interests of a privileged class who look upon the great masses of the people as intended but to be hewers of their wood and drawers of their water. In November of 1881, Henry delivered an address on the land question in Dublin, followed by a second address at the beginning of January 1882. He then sailed to England, where he met with the prominent Irish leaders imprisoned in London. He also met with Helen Taylor, the stepdaughter of John Stuart Mill, who assured George that Mill would have embraced the truths revealed in Progress and Poverty. In January of 1882, Henry received from the socialist leader Henry M. Hyndman a copy of a 1775 address by Thomas Spence on the real rights of man, delivered before the Philosophical Society of Newcastle. Spence is often referred to by historians as a forerunner of Henry George, as they shared many insights. In this address, Spence proclaimed common rights in land and proposed that land values be taken for public purposes, taxing nothing else. George urged Hyndman to publish Spence's lecture as evidence that this position had a long history of support. George also met Herbert Spencer, author of the book Social Statics, first published in 1851, in which the philosopher expressed views similar to those held by Henry George on the land question. However, by this time, Spencer had changed his views, and their meeting left George with, quote, a deep disappointment, unquote. In August of 1882, Henry embarked on an investigative trip through Western Ireland. He and an English companion were arrested by the police under the Crimes Act as suspicious strangers. George later recorded that to come to Ireland only to be mistaken for an emissary of sedition, a would-be assassin of landlords, or maimer of cattle, was something that had not entered into my companion's calculations. Later the same day, in the town of Athenry, he was again arrested. In both instances, he was released within a few hours. However, he wrote to the President of the United States describing what he observed as the mistreatment of U.S. citizens in Ireland by British authorities. Henry George's arrests were reported in all of the Irish and British newspapers, which stimulated the demand for his books. A serious review of Progress and Poverty appeared in the London Times. Sales in Australia and New Zealand were also increasing. Back in the United States, the New York Times printed this short poem on Henry George written by Emma Lazarus. In October of 1882, Henry returned from Ireland, his services as a lecturer and writer now in great demand. Among other places, he was invited to speak in St. Louis, Missouri, Terre Haute, Indiana, and Wheeling, West Virginia. By 1883, some leaders of organized labor in the United States began to champion his proposals. Knights of Labor leader Terence Powderly became a strong supporter and saw that George's writings were distributed widely to members. Later that year, Henry George joined with others to form the Free Soil Society with the stated purpose to, quote, free the soil from land speculation, unquote. Founding members included Lewis F. Post, former editor of Truth, and members of the Irish World editorial staff. Lewis F. Post had been an assistant U.S. attorney in New York City, but he had turned to journalism and begun to edit The Public, a weekly journal devoted to the single-tax politics of Henry George. Later in life, he served as Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Labor in 1913. Henry's financial condition was temporarily improved by receipt of a $1,000 bequest left by a supporter named Francis Shaw. He now set aside time to begin his book attacking tariffs and other restraints on trade. Still in 1883, he wrote a series of articles for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper under the title Problems of the Time. In the fifth article, George provided evidence of the increasing concentration of land holdings and a fall in the number of farms. These articles were published together in book form with 8 additional chapters under the title Social Problems. Introducing the work, he wrote, "My endeavor has been to present the momentous social problems of our time. unencumbered by technicalities and without the abstract reasoning which some of the principles of political economy require for thorough explanation. From Professor William Swinton came a suggestion that George produce an abridged and annotated edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. George began the work but was soon diverted and never returned to the project. Henry George spends remarkably few pages in his book, Progress and Poverty, analyzing the positions taken by Adam Smith. In the end, he is dismayed that Smith's thinking does not meet a true test of scientific investigation. In George's chapter on the law of wages, he recognizes Adam Smith for also rightly concluding that high wages existed, quote, where land was yet open to settlement, unquote. Yet, in reviewing Smith's writing on the subject, George concludes that Smith failed to appreciate the true laws of the distribution of wealth only because he turned away from the more primitive forms of society to look for first principles amid complex social manifestations, where he was blinded by a pre-accepted theory of the functions of capital and a vague acceptance of the doctrine which, 2 years after his death, was formulated by Malthus. Supporters in Britain arranged a lecture tour for Henry George throughout England and Scotland. At Oxford University, a young professor, Arnold Toynbee, developed 2 lectures responding to Progress and Poverty. Unfortunately, Toynbee died suddenly a short time afterward, so that George did not have the opportunity to debate him on the issues. Joseph Chamberlain, leader of the so-called radicals in Parliament, fearful of the growing influence of Henry George's ideas, wrote, "If something is not done quickly to meet the growing necessities of the case, we may live to see theories as wild and methods as unjust as those suggested by the American economist, adopted as the creed of no inconsiderable portion of the electorate." In December of 1883, Henry arrived in Liverpool, England. His first lecture occurred on the 9th of January, 1884, in St. James Hall, London. In this and subsequent lectures in Plymouth, Birmingham, and Liverpool, he argued against confiscation of land for redistribution, but also argued against compensation to landlords for any land that might be taken. What he wanted was to stop confiscation, the confiscation by those who called themselves landlords of rent, which belonged not to them, but to the entire community. In March of 1884, Henry lectured at Oxford University before an essentially hostile audience, representative of the privileged classes of Britain. Here, the political economist Alfred Marshall challenged George on a number of fronts. Marshall declared that not a single economic doctrine advanced in Progress and Poverty was both new and true, since what was new was not true, and what was true was not new. Marshall also accused George of not understanding any of the authors George had criticized. George responded that the book was based upon the truth, and the truth could not be a new thing. It always had existed, and it must be everlasting. Marshall remained unconvinced, and their exchange ended with what amounted to an agreement to disagree. George then went on to lecture at Cambridge, where his reception was far more cordial, even from many opponents. In April of 1884, Henry traveled to Dublin at the invitation of the Irish nationalist and land reformer Michael Davitt to address a large audience in Dublin, after which he returned to New York. Over the next several months, he wrote several articles, including a response to an attack on Progress and Poverty made by the Duke of Argyll. This was published in pamphlet form. In October of 1884, Henry once again journeyed to Britain, this time at the request of the Scottish Land Restoration League. He delivered a major address in London with the Irish land reformer Michael Davitt, now fully committed to his solution to the land question, among the other speakers. After delivering several speeches to growing audiences, he finally returned to the United States. Remarkably, in Britain, now even Joseph Chamberlain was now calling for the taxation of land values in his own speeches. His next book, Protection or Free Trade, appeared in 1886. Several chapters from the book appeared in serial form in various newspapers. Henry now made the acquaintance of a wealthy businessman, Tom L. Johnson, who gained his fortune by acquiring street railroad franchises. After reading both Social Problems and Progress and Poverty, Johnson called on Henry George in Brooklyn. Although Johnson's fortune was based on monopoly privileges he secured from government, he saw the truth in Henry George's writings. He later recalled, "I went to talk to Mr. George about his cause, and I wanted in some way to call it my cause too. But he stretched out on a lounge, and I sat in a chair, and I found myself telling him the story of my life." With his fame growing, Henry George was drafted in 1886 by the New York labor unions to run for the office of mayor of New York City. The Tammany political machine nominated Abram S. Hewitt. The Republicans nominated a young Theodore Roosevelt. A Tammany official approached George, telling him that if he refused the nomination, they would run him for Congress. George responded, "You tell me I cannot possibly get the office. Why, if I cannot possibly get the office, do you want me to withdraw?" His reply, "You cannot be elected, but your running will raise hell." George responded, "You have relieved me of embarrassment. I do not want the responsibility and the work of the office of the mayor of New York, but I do want to raise hell. I am decided and will run." George finished second behind Abram Hewitt. He received over 68,000 official votes. More were said to be floating down the Hudson River. In January of 1887, Henry started a newspaper, The Standard, in New York City. Lewis F. Post joined the paper as editorial and special writer, and Henry George's eldest son came aboard as correspondence editor. The paper defended the Reverend Dr. Edward McGlynn, who in supporting George's campaign was suspended for holding views contrary to Catholic doctrine. In The Standard, George wrote, "What Dr. McGlynn is punished for is for taking the side of the working men against the system of injustice and spoliation and the rotten rings which have made the government in New York a byword of corruption." Henry George and Dr. McGlynn joined forces to form the Anti-Poverty Society. The solution to the land question, as Henry George proposed, came to be described as the single tax. The term is said to have been originated with Henry George's collaborator, Thomas Sherman. In 1888, William Lloyd Garrison, Jr., son of the anti-slavery crusader, joined the single tax campaign. Of Henry George, he wrote in 1898, following George's death, "I may be mistaken, but I place him among the great benefactors of the race. It was a privilege to know and love him, and a satisfaction to feel that I cast my lot with him in this day of small things, when such tribute as the nations paid him at the last was beyond the most extravagant dream. Without the right of all men to the use of the earth, men must be in subjection to their brothers, and the extremes of wealth and poverty alarm civilization." From Russia, Leo Tolstoy added his own voice to that of Henry George's. Tolstoy became an ardent supporter of Henry George's proposals as a solution to Russia's social problems. In his novel Resurrection, he presented George's solution to the land question. Henry George planned to visit Tolstoy during the 1890s, but health problems prevented him from doing so before his death in 1897. However, they exchanged correspondence, and in a letter Tolstoy wrote dated the 8th of April, 1896, he conveyed his thanks to Henry George. There is nothing that widens so much the horizon, that gives such firm support or such a clear view of things as the consciousness that although it is but in this life that we have the possibility and the duty to act, nevertheless this is not the whole of life, but that bit of it only which is open to our understanding. The reading of every one of your books makes clear to me more and more the truth and practicality of your system. In an 1888 interview, Tolstoy predicted that Henry George's vision would soon be realized. In 30 years, private property in land will be as much a thing of the past as now is serfdom. Henry George had formulated the next article in the program of the progressivist liberals of the world. What Tolstoy failed to foresee was that the elimination of private property and land occurred in Russia and elsewhere under circumstances very different from those proposed by Henry George. Early in 1889, Henry made 2 more trips to Britain and Ireland in response to requests by supporters, including Ireland's Michael Davitt. He took time to briefly visit Paris. A new textbook on political economy, consistent with the system developed by Henry George, was now published in Britain, written by Professor J.E. Sims of University College, Nottingham. In the spring of 1890, Henry sailed for Australia, stopping first in Hawaii, then New Zealand. In New Zealand, he is welcomed by Sir George Grey, one of the first prominent statesmen to read Progress and Poverty and champion its message. From the time he landed in Sydney, in Australia, he spoke and lectured almost without pause. The editor of the Australian paper The Standard described Henry George in this way: "Of the great reformer himself, all must admit that as a speaker and as a man he more than justifies all our preconceived admiration. His genial manner and outspoken democracy take the hearts of all true Australians by storm, and his infinite variety of illustration, his incisive logic, and at times passionate eloquence stir his audience to laughter, to deep thought, or to tear almost at his will." Henry was back in New York by September of 1890, where he took part in the first national conference in support of the single tax. The conference was held for 2 days at Cooper Union in New York. At the conference, George spoke somewhat prophetically. "Life, long life, is not the best thing to wish for those you love. Not too long, but that in my day, whether it be long or short, I may do my duty and do my best." In December of 1890, Henry was stricken with what was a mild stroke that affected his language skills, causing him to use inappropriate or manufactured words. He quickly began to recover and did not suffer any paralysis, but this was a sign that his health would not hold up if he continued at the pace of recent years. In April of 1891, he decided to write a complete treatise on political economy, tracing its development as a science and explaining the errors of earlier and contemporary writers. The book, his last, was eventually published posthumously with the title The Science of Political Economy. His son, Henry George Jr., completed editing of the manuscript in 1897. He interrupted his research to respond to The Condition of Labor, an encyclical letter issued by Pope Leo XIII. The encyclical was interpreted by Henry George and his supporters as a direct response to their teachings. His response was finished in September, translated into Italian, and presented to Pope Leo XIII personally. The Vatican issued no reply. From England, the noted philosopher Herbert Spencer succumbed to the pressure of being described as a forerunner to Henry George and recanted positions taken in the earlier editions of his book Social Statics. Henry George's response, A Perplexed Philosopher, appeared in 1892. The book sold well and was widely read, but Herbert Spencer did not engage George or respond to his charges that Spencer had abandoned his earlier principles. The 1892 edition of Social Statics eliminated the earlier passages containing his argument against private ownership of land. George set the tone of his rebuttal, stating, "Since philosophy is the search for truth, the philosopher who in his teachings is swerved by favor or by fear forfeits all esteem as a philosopher. A man of special learning may be a fool as to common relations, and that he who passes for an intellectual prince may be a moral pauper, there are examples enough to show." George sided with those who argued that societal law must conform to moral law in order to secure justice. He writes, "Those who contend that the state is the source of all rights may indeed object to any proposed state action that it would be expedient, but they cannot object that it would be wrong." Faced with rising costs and a falling readership, the Standard ceased publication in August of 1892. Henry George's supporters split over who to support in the U.S. presidential election, William McKinley or William Jennings Bryan. Henry supported Bryan despite Bryan's position on the reliance on silver to back paper currency. George argued the best system of money was that of paper currency issued by the government, that is, paper based on the public credit. In 1890, Tom L. Johnson had been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Johnson and several other admirers of Henry George in the House of Representatives succeeded in having the entire text of protection or free trade read into the congressional record. Their franking, that is, mailing without charge privileges, allowed them to send copies to their constituents, 1.2 million in total. In 1894, U.S. Representatives Tom L. Johnson and James G. McGuire of California introduced a single tax amendment to an income tax bill. The amendment received 6 votes in favor, but strangely, applause from the floor of the House when the 6 stood. In 1896, single tax supporters in Delaware embarked on a campaign to get legislation passed requiring that all revenue be raised from the taxation of land values. The effort failed. One reason was that Delaware voters reacted negatively to the arrival of so many outsiders calling for changes in Delaware's laws. A large number of the group were arrested for violating the law against public speaking on the Sabbath. In prison, they formed the Dover Jail Single Tax Club. Henry neared completion of the manuscript of The Science of Political Economy in the spring of 1897. He mailed a copy to his longtime friend in San Francisco, Dr. Edward R. Taylor, for comment. Between then and October, he continued to write and rewrite sections of the book, including a somewhat autobiographical chapter. In October, he was drafted to run for the office of mayor of the city of New York as an independent candidate. Accepting the nomination in a speech delivered at Cooper Union on the 5th of October, he declared, "I have not sought this nomination directly or indirectly. It has been repugnant to me. My line lay in a different path, and I hope to tread it. But I hope with Thomas Jefferson that while a citizen who can afford to should not seek office, no man can ignore the will of those with whom he stands when they have asked him to come to the front and represent a principle." 22nd of October 1897, he delivered a campaign speech at Turner Hall in College Point. He was introduced as the great friend of labor and democracy. He told his supporters, "I have never claimed to be a special friend of labor. Let us have done with this call for special privileges for labor. Labor does not want special privileges. I have never advocated nor asked for special privileges or special sympathy for working men. What I stand for is the equal rights of all men." He spoke twice more that evening, the second time at the Central Opera House in Manhattan, which was described by those attending as disconnected and rambling. In the early morning hours of the 23rd of October, his wife found him standing, repeating the word yes again and again. Within a few hours, he drifted into unconsciousness and died. Over 100,000 people passed by his coffin to gain a final glimpse at the man deserved of their respect. His son later wrote, "He died a hero's death. He died as he would have wished to die, on the battlefield, spending his last strength in a blow at the enemies of the people." He died believing his purpose was fulfilled. The truth that I have tried to make clear will not find easy acceptance. If that could be, it would have been accepted long ago. If that could be, it would never have been obscured. But it will find friends, those who will toil for it, suffer for it, if need be, die for it. This is the power of truth. In the United States, Tom L. Johnson became the movement's most important leader. Johnson was elected mayor of Cleveland, Ohio in 1901 and remained active until his death in 1911. A statue of Johnson occupies a place of honor in Cleveland. The book he holds is Henry George's Progress and Poverty. Louis F. Post took over as editor of The Public, a weekly newspaper based in Chicago. He contributed his own major work, Ethics of Democracy, in 1903, which he dedicated to Henry George. In 1913, he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson to his cabinet as Undersecretary of Labor. He died at the beginning of 1928. In New York, a developer named Lawson Purdy campaigned for separate land assessments and the taxation of land values. He came to head the New York City Tax Department around 1911. In 1936, he was elected to the board of the Robert Schockenbach Foundation, established 10 years earlier to ensure that Henry George's books were kept in print. Joseph Fels, whose family had built a sizable fortune manufacturing soaps, first became interested in the single tax movement in 1891 in Philadelphia. He would spend a major portion of his share of this fortune trying to make the single tax a reality. In 1899, Fels contributed funds for the construction of a library and other projects in the colony of Fairhope, Alabama, founded in part on the principles espoused by Henry George. Beginning in 1901, he spent most of his time in Britain working on various land projects. He also provided matching grants to the London-based United Committee for the Taxation of Land Values, and in 1909 he was instrumental in gaining the support for a land tax bill from Lloyd George. Early in 1909, Fels launched the Joseph Fels Fund in an effort to jumpstart what he recognized was the failing campaign in the United States. He pledged $25,000 a year for 5 years, yet he was overspending and fast depleting his own financial reserves. He died on the 22nd of February 1914. The Joseph Fels Fund was dissolved in 1916. In 1910, the Joseph Fels Fund Commission organized its first single tax conference in New York. In 1914, Pennsylvania amended its state constitution to permit large cities to apply a separate rate of taxation to assess land values than to property improvements. Pittsburgh and Scranton now had a local option to adopt this system. In 1920, the Single Tax Party held its first convention in New York City. The party's presidential candidate was Robert C. McCauley. Richard C. Barnum ran for vice president. Carrie Chapman Catt, one of the nation's leading suffragists, was nominated to run as vice president, but did not gain a sufficient number of delegates. In 1924, a second convention was held, the party changing its name to the Commonwealth Land Party. William J. Wallace was chosen to run for president, and John C. Lincoln, an industrialist, was the party's candidate for vice president. In 1925, the Robert Schockenbach Foundation was established in New York to ensure Henry George's books remain available. Then in 1926, the Henry George Foundation of America was established in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The foundation brought Georgists, as those who are followers of Henry George began to be referred to, together each year until the mid-1970s. Recently, the foundation was merged with another organization here in Philadelphia to form the Henry George Center for the Study of Economics. In 1932, the Henry George School of Social Science was established in New York City. The philosopher John Dewey agreed to serve as the school's first honorary president. During the 1930s, extensions were opened all across the United States and Canada. Affiliated schools operated in Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. In 1909, while still in the liberal camp, Winston Churchill delivered a series of hard-hitting campaign speeches against land monopoly and calling for the taxation of land values. In one speech, Churchill declared, "It is quite true that the land monopoly is not the only monopoly which exists, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all other forms of monopoly. It is quite true that unearned increments in land are not the only form of unearned or undeserved profit which individuals are able to secure, but it is the principal form of unearned increment which is derived from processes which are not merely not beneficial, but which are positively detrimental to the general public. Land, which is a necessity of human existence, which is the original source of all wealth, which is strictly limited in extent, which is fixed in geographical position. Land, I say, differs from all other forms of property in these primary and fundamental conditions." Sun Yat-sen, leader of the Chinese nationalists, read Progress and Poverty around 1897. George's influence on his thinking is found in an essay written that year. In this essay, he argued that China's agrarian problems were not the consequence of overpopulation or of the insufficiency of arable land, but rather of inadequate transport, internal trade barriers, and unfair import competition. By 1899, Sun was calling attention to the heavy burdens of land rents upon the farmers, writing, "We propose that the government shall levy a tax proportionate to the price of the land, and if necessary, buy back the land according to its price." From Berlin in 1931, Albert Einstein, responding to a letter regarding Henry George from a woman in Pennsylvania, wrote, "I have read for most parts Henry George's book with extraordinary interest, and I believe that its main outline represents an indisputable point of view, particularly with regard to the cause of poverty." Frederick Howe studied at Johns Hopkins University under Woodrow Wilson and economist Richard Ely. He later served in the city administration of Tom L. Johnson in Cleveland. He was eventually appointed commissioner of Ellis Island by President Wilson. Sounding very much like Henry George, Howe wrote, "Men who worked the hardest and who had often the greatest ability received the smallest returns. Those who contributed most to the community by building up industry, producing useful things, for some reason or other did not rise. But year after year, the other group grew rich and acquired social and political power." Francis Nielsen, author of the great anti-war book published at the outbreak of the First World War, How Diplomats Make War, and member of the British Parliament, arrived in the United States in 1915. In 1920, Nielsen founded the Freeman, one purpose of which was to keep the perspectives of Henry George in the public dialogue. The individualist writer Albert J. Nock came aboard as editor of the Freeman, which continued publication for 4 years under Nock. Then in 1937, a group of Henry George's supporters resurrected the Freeman, with Henry George's daughter, Anna George DeMille, as president. This new version of the Freeman survived until the middle of the Second World War. Today, a number of publications continue to be produced and distributed by various organizations devoted to Henry George's cause. In the United States, the most important is the Georgist Journal, published by the Henry George Institute. In the United Kingdom, the Henry George Foundation of Great Britain publishes Land and Liberty. Prosper Australia publishes Progress. A council of Georgist organizations holds an annual conference at different locations throughout North America. The International Union for Land Value Taxation, based in London, has NGO status at the United Nations, publishes books, other materials, and holds an international conference every few years. The Robert Schachenbach Foundation continues its work and has recently funded the documentary film The End of Poverty, Think Again. For the cause initiated nearly 140 years ago by Henry George, these words by Winston Churchill seem quite appropriate as a fitting end. Now this is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Thank you.